coming up on the Lead Ministry Podcast.
It's a Sunday morning and they've gotten the kids there. Everybody looks generally okay. And Sunday now is over and they're expecting you, Bill, to come home with dinner. And they're like, okay, all I got to do is hold this rock for another 7 minutes. I can see that he's on his way. And then all of a sudden you come bursting in the door and they're like, hey, I love you. A special meeting was called. I got a bolt. I didn't get dinner.
And now your host, Josh Denhart.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lead Ministry Podcast. We're going to take a deep dive today to talk about a little bit of a tender issue, a little bit of of something that doesn't get discussed that often, but I think is extremely important. We're going to talk today about ministry spouses. And if you're on staff or if you're the lead person at your church in a particular ministry area and you happen to be married and you have kids, it can be pretty tough on our spouses. So that's kind of the angle for today. And we have our good friend and guest and kind of co-host, not guest, kind of co-host, Bill Van Kirk. Bill, good morning to you.
Good morning. It's good to see you, Josh.
Good to see you, buddy. So today we're going to jump right in and we're going to talk about the hardship that ends up happening for a spouse who has to, Sunday morning, here we are. It's Sunday morning.
Yes.
The ministry staff leader is at church at dark 30 and the spouse has to be showered, have their own teeth brushed. They have to, get up however many children they have, get them even nominally presentable.
Right.
They have to find a parking spot at church. And you live in Wisconsin, I live in Iowa. So it often about a third of the year, it's cold, it's snowy, it's hard. It can be hard on our spouses. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, that's such a big thing. I would say even right off the bat, I'll tell you that my wife, that was, I think, one of the hardest adjustments when I got into ministry was like, my husband is not my husband and he's not a father, or so it seems, on Sunday morning because he's distracted with everything else.
Yeah. And let's not even go so far as distracted, though we can go there. We can talk about what it means to be a distracted parent or a distracted spouse. I was on a coaching call with a dear brother in Chicago, and he was like, how do I deal with this? How do I honor my calling and yet also honor my family? Because it's not that I'm distracted, it's that I have responsibilities.
Right.
And
absolutely.
they're hard. And I have to figure those out. And so how do we go about doing that? So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's not easy. But I think that my wife as well, she, we stepped into this and all of a sudden it was a rude awakening because we're in it together, right?
Right.
It's not just that I have a calling and she's this kind of come alongside secondary thought. She feels called. We're one, and she feels called.
Yes, absolutely.
But there is a cost to standing in this line at the job fair.
Yeah, there really is. Yeah. It's funny because even to this day, my wife, when she comes to church, she comes to our second service on Sunday morning. And I've been there since like 6 a.m, right?
Yeah.
And she comes in and she's so funny. It's kind of a joke between us now. She'll like walk in and she'll be like, "Hi, Pastor." And then like go and check our kids in and then like get ready for church. And then I'll come sit by her and in the service, if I can, for the second service, if I'm not preaching. And she'll be like, "Oh, the pastor's sitting by me today."
Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny.
It is funny. And I know my wife said to a pastor friend of ours' spouse, And so both the husbands, me and this other guy, were on staff, and our spouses were kind of joking / commiserating / trying to make sense of their lives, right? And they said, okay, you go to Target and you see, hey, this parking spot is for women who are expecting. This parking spot is for whatever. And she said, would it be okay if we had a parking spot for ministry spouses with small children?
Yes, that would be awesome.
Yeah. And it was kind of a joke, but it kind of wasn't, right? And so, before we clicked record, Bill, you brought up two things. I think there's a third, actually. So the three big buckets today is, number one, hey, ministry leader who's on staff, be aware that it is very hard for your wife or your husband who's running this solo. So we're going to talk about that. Number two, hey, spouse, maybe the ministry leader is listening to this podcast and they're going to be like, hey, honey, this is one that I think you need to listen to. That's the other component. And then it's the church at large and things that the church at large can do to help mitigate some of these issues, right?
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And so let's talk about that third one briefly, the church at large. Yes, Sunday is a work day, and, but do we need to stack everything on a Sunday, right? So like all of a sudden somebody's like, oh my word, as soon as service is done, people are kind of already here. So let's have that meeting. I mean, and I get that. I have even suggested that. Don't find a new time. Find a time while they're currently here.
Sure.
But like I said, I was on this call, this coaching call yesterday, and this fella was like, well, I'm a part of this group of mentoring these people, and we meet on a weeknight, but then we all of a sudden somebody decided, hey, let's do this right after church. And that, okay, I get it. But maybe, just maybe, that has ancillary costs to a ministry spouse that are extremely heavy.
Right. I think so. Yeah. Like, it's interesting because I think each pastor or ministry leader really has to like figure out how this is going to work for their family. Like,
yes.
Incorporating ministry in their family life is something that I think everyone's going to deal with in a little bit different way.
Sure.
And they're going to have to find their own solution. So one that I've noticed is, yes, we have meetings sometimes after church, but on a normal week, we don't. And I intentionally try not to sign up for things that happen right after church because it can be a stressful time. And so the other thing that has been super helpful for me is it's kind of my wife's idea. She's like, hey, how about if just on Sunday, once a week, you are in charge of lunch after church? And that seems like just a small, like little thing, like you would think that's not a big deal, but she gets the kids after being at church and she goes home and she waits for me because I'm the one locking up. And
Sure.
And so every time I come home on Sunday, I make sure I have lunch with me because that way it's just one less thing that she has to worry about,
Yeah.
In the morning when she's getting ready to go to church and all those things, she's not thinking about, oh, now I have to like think about what our family's going to eat for lunch and all this other stuff. She knows she can get home, kind of unwind, all of that stuff. And when I get home, we're going to eat lunch together as a family. So that's been a huge piece in our family.
Yeah, I think that's a really good internal personal solution. And that's something that we're going to flip between the things that the church needs to think about, things the spouse needs to think about, and things that the staff person needs to think about. And that is something that the staff person needs to think about, which is, how can I find some ways to mitigate this hardship? Because it is a hardship. I think of it as job hazards. Every job has hazards, right? If all of a sudden you are a construction worker building roads on a busy 4-lane interstate, you have a job hazard. It is getting clipped by a semi-truck.
Yes.
That is a job hazard. If you are a police officer, okay, we can obviously think through some of the scenarios that would be hazardous there. The list goes on for every job. And in this particular job as a church, it's somebody on church staff, there are job hazards. And part of it is that Sunday is really, really, really hard for our spouses. It is a job hazard. Now, you got to understand, there is all of these different cost and benefit ratios with every line that you stand in at the job fair. And so if you stand in the line as, you're going to go on staff at a church, you're like, okay, so here are some of the costs and here are some of the massive benefits. And like, you just have to, there is some level of, and by the way, there's some level of ownership, just straight up. Like, this is what it is. And I know of some friends of ours, he's a ministry leader, and, I love these people, but I have watched over the years to where she is crying foul about the church and about her spouse, about things that are pretty much, no, this is the lane that you guys stood in.
Right.
Like, all of a sudden, if you think, well, I don't want to have the Sunday problems, and you're continuing to fight against that, it's like, oh, wait, I'm sorry. Like, church is Sunday.
Right. Absolutely.
You're not going to get away from that. And no amount of complaining or no amount of strategizing is going to be that your husband is home helping you pull together the kids and get them to church, and you guys get to sit together at your service of choice. I'm sorry, that's just not what you guys signed up for.
Right. So there's a bit of like recognizing as a ministry family, counting the cost, in other words, of being in ministry. And, honestly, that's a really great point, because I've seen it happen over and over again where people join our staff. Maybe first they join our staff as like a midweek helper. They're doing administrative work. And then all of a sudden they're like, okay, we're going to need you to do some work on the weekends. And that transition point is always very difficult for ministry leaders when their family is like, wait a second, you mean to tell me that every Sunday I don't have my spouse, and every holiday my spouse is, every Easter, every Christmas, there's no more family things because Christmas Eve belongs to the church. Easter Sunday belongs to the church. And so that I've seen really hard transitions with that. And
oh, dude.
Sometimes people can't stick it out because they're not willing to give that up as a cost.
And so that's the you have to, it's the not so fine print on the application that you're filling out in the line at the job fair.
Right.
And so somebody is gung ho. And by the way, this is my story, right? I mean, I was a high school chemistry teacher who was very involved in ministry, and they're like, hey man, why don't you just take over, so to speak? And so I took this job, and all of a sudden then, how many Christmas Eve services did we have? And so our Christmas Eve traditions had to adjust based on the career path that I chose.
Right. And there's what's interesting about it, what I noticed getting into ministry, and this is maybe helpful for someone to think about, is that ripple effect is not just for your immediate family, but it actually, in those cases, extends to your extended family, because the rest of the world is operating on this weekend mentality.
Right.
And so if all of a sudden you're tied up every Sunday, it's like, well, we were going to spend, extended family time at the cabin this weekend. Well, it's like, well, I'm sorry, but I have to leave Saturday night because I have to be there on Sunday morning. Right. And like, and so there is a huge ripple effect of it.
There is. And so again, this is the cost counting. Okay. Another piece that I want to speak to say, hey, church, this is a hard one. You're actually hiring one person. This is not a twofer.
Yes. Yeah, that's huge. This is one thing that I super love about our senior leader at my church is whenever we bring people in to interview them, he has a little talk with them, and he says, listen, I want you to know we are hiring you. Mm-hmm. We are not hiring you and your spouse. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now we know it's a ministry family sort of thing, but we want your spouse to be involved at the level they want to be involved in. We're not trying to get a twofer. And he always has that. He says that every single time. And you wouldn't believe the amount of ministry leaders coming from other ministries who just go,
Yeah.
that's so nice, because in my last church, they expected my wife or my husband to do this and this and this and this. And they didn't get paid, but I got paid.
Yep. And so what you said, the operative word there was they expected.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were blessed that the church that we served at for, well over a decade, that was their ethic, just like your church has that ethic. There was never a direct sit down to say we don't have any expectations for you, but there was this culture that existed, right? It's called the unwritten handbook, right? Every church has a handbook, and then you have the unwritten handbook. And the unwritten handbook was, hey, you never, ever, ever go approach some other staff person's spouse to volunteer in your area without first talking to the ministry leader who's on staff about whether it would be cool to ask their spouse right? So there was this little bit of a boundary. And so one time I did desire for this person's spouse, and I went to them and talked to them, and they're like, okay, let me think about this. Let me go broach this with my spouse. The other thing is my wife, I was at this church for 10 years, and her exclusive job, her exclusive role as a volunteer, she did other things, but primarily it was once a month nursery captain. That's it. Nothing more, nothing less. And there wasn't any expectation anywhere else. And she did not feel any pressure whatsoever. So that's huge. Okay. Now I'm going to, hey, church, don't think that you're getting a twofer. That's rude. That's actually like, I could argue from a labor law standpoint, you're maybe breaking the law on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We won't go too far down that road, but now I want to shift and not talk about the church, but I want to shift to the first person, which is, hey, you ministry leader. Quick warning. If your spouse is your number one go-to as a substitute for any and all holes, if all of a sudden somebody calls in on Saturday night, you're like, you're on. Okay. No bueno. That's not a good thing.
Yeah.
And I've seen that happen a lot where the spouse isn't being expected by the church. They're being expected by their spouse to go, hey, my life is crazy. Things are falling apart. You are needed immediately. I am voluntolding you. You are voluntold. You're not volunteer, you're voluntold. And you are my number one, substitute teacher. What'd you say?
Yes. Fill in. You're my number one fill-in.
That is not a good move.
Yep.
Now, some spouses are and by the way, this is not, I would say this, like the book of Proverbs has a lot of guidelines, and they aren't necessarily law. So this is a guideline. This is not a law. If your spouse is like, hey man, this is my calling, and I am the come alongside, and I am the fill in the gap. That is, I'm in. I want that. That's great. But if there's some kind of a random, I don't know, pressure or expectation, you just got to be careful there. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what you're looking for in that scenario of the ministry leader is you need to make sure that you're keeping a check on any sort of bitterness or resentment that's coming because of your involvement in ministry. That if you're sensing bitterness or resentment, that for you should be like a yellow flag, a red flag for, hey, maybe we need to adjust something. Am I expecting too much out of you as a ministry spouse? I think that's super helpful to keep our pulse on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think now we've talked about the church. We've talked about the ministry leader. Now I want to talk about the spouse just for a minute. And I think that the spouse needs to speak up and needs to define how they're feeling on the regular. And the spouse who is on staff, they may, depending on personalities, they may need to initiate this discussion and say, hey, how are we doing here? Scale of 1 to 10. The last 4 Sundays, how have you felt? And then it's now impingent upon that ministry spouse to be honest, transparent, and say the words, actually, I'm a little bit ticked off,
Yeah. Yeah, they need to be able to articulate how they're feeling about it. I mean, I think we've had that journey in my own relationship. It was really hard when I switched over from being in student ministry, which my wife is very passionate about.
Oh boy.
And then I became an adult ministries pastor. And what the expectation that she had in her head was when we got married was I'm marrying a youth pastor. Like I'm marrying somebody who wants to go in student ministry and we're going to do ministry together. And so when that all of a sudden wasn't the case, she had like an identity crisis in a sense of
That's
like, wait a second, this is not what I had signed up for. And she'll tell you, I mean, she has gone through this process of the Lord saying like, your identity is not in being a pastor's wife. Your identity is in Christ. And she had to like work through all of those things. And now she can tell you like a healthier view of it. But that was a lot of hard work that she had to do
fair.
in her. And so I think spouses of ministry leaders maybe need to have those assessments where they meet with the Lord and they like try to figure out what's going on in their heart, especially if they feel like something's wrong.
Yes, I would concur that my wife and we were in it together in a lot of ways. And then when I came on staff, like we weren't in it in the same way that we were historically.
Right.
And the other thing too, my wife says this, being a mom of littles. And I'm sorry, our kids are big now, but now I look back or I am like someplace, like we were at we were like the guest speakers for a big parenting weekend at this church I think we were in Indiana. It might've been Ohio. I can't remember, but here we were, and I had preached that morning and we're waiting for the big parenting weekend and we're eating lunch for those who are staying around and pulling this whole thing together. And yes, spouses of staff members were there pulling load, right? Whatever. But we were all eating together. And this one mom had multiple kids on her knees, was cutting food, shoving it in their mouth, grabbing this other kid, putting food in her mouth. And all of a sudden I was like, that is a mom of littles.
Yep.
That is a totally different cost factor than when you have high school kids. Okay, so
100%.
On this call that I had yesterday with this ministry leader, and we were discussing these very things, I said, okay, quick question. Can your child, your oldest child, how old are they? They're 3. And you have a newborn? Yes. Oh, brother. And I said, quick thing. I was like, do you guys want to have more kids? And he said, oh yeah. And I was like, okay, hey, that's great. It's just going to add more complexity. Dude, we got 4 kids. I get it, but it's just going to add complexity. I said, okay, quick question. Can your oldest child strap themselves into a car seat? And he was like, no. And I said, oh baby, just wait. That is an amazing moment.
Yes.
Number 2, can your 3-year-old not pick out their clothes, but can they put on their clothes, including socks? He goes, nowhere close. And I said, that is a wonderful, wonderful day.
Yes.
So there are all these benchmarks that you don't know exist, where some, but not all of the pressure actually begins to release because you don't have to do everything. And I said, you as a parent of these littles, you can't conceive of a day when they're going to be doing things that lighten your load. You don't have a concept or a framework for that. It's crazy, isn't it?
It is crazy. And I tell moms and dads with littles all the time, like, hey, I know you're in the thick of it. I was just officiating a wedding and this last weekend, and the night before we did the rehearsal dinner, and there was a delay in the food because the couple was doing it at their house. And so like there was a delay in getting the food. Well, it was already like 7:30, almost 8 o'clock. The food's not ready. And these kids are like, have traveled here and then not been fed. And like the food finally comes out and the moms right away are like, can I just get in here and get food for my kids? And they're like trying to cut up the hot dogs, and they're trying to get everything going. And Erica and I, my wife and I, were both like, we know that stage. Like, we recognize the moment you're in right now where you're like, oh my goodness, like my kids need to eat and they're crabby and like all the things. And I took the parents aside and I said, look, I just want you to know, I recognize the position you're in right now and how difficult it is to manage all of those things. And you need to know this gets better. This actually does get better in terms of you needing to be that hands-on. And it's a great reminder for those in ministry with littles right now, because what people need to hear, especially moms, I think, they need to hear is this is a season of your life, and it's not always going to be like this. And if you're feeling pressure because you're in your family's in ministry, it's okay to be in the season of being mom and not try to do everything for the church at the same time.
1,000%. And so, number one, to the ministry leader, have your eyes wide open that if you have little kids, if you have a spouse with littles, it is harder. Therefore, make extra consolations. Don't be a jerk, because you're going to pay for that in 20 years when your spouse has hurts, legitimate, real deal hurts, and has little, I'm going to call it small t trauma responses when they don't feel supported. Don't go there. Number two, the spouse who maybe has littles, cry out for help. In church, if you no longer have littles, maybe you should be like Bill and go tell the moms and the dads of littles, I see you, this is hard, extra grace for you, and you don't need to do it all. I told this fella who I was doing this coaching call with, I said, hey man, what if you were to tell the leaders, of which you are one, who are doing this Sunday afternoon mentorship thing, or the Sunday after church mentorship thing? I said, what if you said to them, hey, this is all good, but I'm cool to do this on a Tuesday night, but Sunday afternoons, this is not going to be, I'm not going to be able to roll that. So, count the cost on that one. I want to say as we close this episode, there's a great book, very small, but very articulate, called Choosing to Cheat. Now that's a pretty provocative title.
It is.
Choosing to Cheat. It's by Andy Stanley. It's very small. I would suggest for anybody who's on staff that they legitimately should read that. There's very few times, Bill, that I'm going to say, I'm not much of a reader, brother. And so, but this is one that I think everybody should listen to. Choosing to Cheat. And he's like this. The premise is this. Something's going to get cheated. You're never going to have enough. And so you can choose to cheat your family, or you can choose to cheat the church. And somebody's going to get the raw end of the deal. And there are times it's a balance. There are seasons, we get that. But his angle was, okay, God, I did as much as I possibly could for your church. You fill in the gaps. As opposed to, God, I'm spending every single bit on the church. Here's my family, fill in the gaps. No, he's choosing to cheat the church, banking on the idea that a sovereign God is going to fill in those gaps. And that's the premise of the book. One of the things that he says in the book is when the spouse is figuratively holding a 32-pound boulder. Now that's not light. That's not 80 pounds, but it's not 1 pound.
Right.
A 32-pound rock, and their arms are being pulled down by the weight of that, and it's a Sunday morning, and they've gotten the kids there. Everybody looks generally okay, and Sunday now is over, and they're expecting you, Bill, to come home with dinner, and they're like, okay, all I got to do is hold this rock for another 7 minutes. I can see that he's on his way. And then all of a sudden you come bursting in the door and are like, hey, I love you. A special meeting was called. I got a bolt. I didn't get dinner. I didn't get lunch for us. And Jewel, if you're on YouTube, you can see Bill's face. And so all of a sudden then the relief that spouse thought was coming, now there's no additional weight. You've just got to keep holding on. Yep. And that's excruciating. And that is brutal.
Yeah,
and I think we want to steer clear of that. So there's a lot to say on this topic. If you're listening to this podcast, think about who might be a worthy person to listen. Well, Bill, this has been great. Grateful for you, buddy. Thanks for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It was so good.
Yeah. All right, gang. This has been the Lead Ministry Podcast, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Lead Ministry Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, and visit leadvolunteers.com for more episodes and resources. Thanks for listening.